The Confederate separatists engaging in their insurrections have fundamentally sought for the mimicry or the fake replacement to the legitimate thing, so that they, in their inferiority, can promote their degenerates and mimic the function, and thus the action is not served adequately. And to this extent, you perpetuate the generation of not having the thing done properly, and thus it is fundamentally faulty at every level. And thus, the white supremacist communism generates the promotion of the weakness, and thus is itself a fundamental disease. And to the extent that this has been promoted, you have the systems of a society that cannot at any time generate stability. It is like heaven without God in Diablo, the games where you need some pseudo human character to come in and clean up the angelic messes as their fundamental failings to have properly conducted all of the services generates the infinite threats of hell, which is brought to earth as a system perpetually cycling itself and is not avoidable, generating the position of the permanent draw back into hell, and that they only just barely continue to escape the function of its death, and thus the action of the humans becoming insane at the point that they have defeated Diablo or one of the other prime evils generates the infinite weakness that anyone that could become that strong would not last, and thus the action of anyone that is not that strong will at every time consistently fail. And this is what the United States is like without David Bowles in his natural position. By the white supremacists, the reduction of all of the free market advantages creates those weaknesses, and thus the action of having targeted people on the basis of overthrowing the American system in the promotion of the Confederates generates the non value and thus the fundamental destabilizing of the system, which, having been demoralized into its own destruction, has established itself according to that inferiority, which by definition is fundamentally suicidal. And the United States, having been demoralized, I believe it was since the 70s, has suffered the coup in the mid 80s, which, having found the intelligence reports about David, engages in the function of the systematic terrorisms against those systems. Having been demoralized, they are incapable of discerning fact from fiction, and no matter how much proof you show these delusional freaks, they will only reinforce their position as delusional psychopaths. And to this extent, they will consistently support the fraudulent arguments for the terrorism and subversions and secrets in favor of the injury to the host in favor of the parasite, which, like a praying mantis, will have the female eat the male, and the male being eaten by the female is also to be reproduced from its infants, and thus the action of Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII, which gives birth by his memory like a mantis parasite, which forces the mantis into water that the parasite might escape and restart the cycle, becomes the perpetuating weakness, and they, believing that they're strong, have proven their inferiority as they are vessels to that parasite. And once they dump into that water, Genova will escape from Sephiroth and will continue from scratch, making him believe that his weakness is his strength, will go to his death, like the position of certain type of fungus, which, having infected an ant, will force it to the tops of the trees and will plant itself at the top so that the fungus might infect the larger colony by pollination. And this is the reproduction system of the Confederates in their hybrid warfare as they seek leaderless groups in the development of their Druid religion and its maintenance, and thus they have set up the state religion of their occult knowledge for their satanic rituals and worship. Now, at one level, there are practicalities to the magic rituals, and at another level, the function is purely religious psychopathy. And to the extent that you enter at the bottom, you think that it is good, and then you develop longer, and then you realize that they are the most evil thing that they could imagine. And then when you go deeper, the evil for the material advantages and trickery is the actual inferior position, and thus the action of it actually being the psychopathic religious actions at the very top so that they can become God is the actual lead, and thus the action of each layer being its own level of psychopathy and its entire worldview has developed itself for the purpose of these transmutable actions in the metamorphosis and development of each of the occult members, which have been raised from scratch as converts from the infected system, and the virus penetrating the cell then goes and reproduces itself with the RNA and then infinitely generates more viruses by the infection, and thus the reproduction of the virus and the non reproduction of the host then explodes the cell, which has been fully compromised, which is the Confederate mission against the Americans, as the non production of Americans is replaced by the creation and reproduction of the Confederates, which becomes the new norm until the host has been burst and ceases to exist as the millions of reproduced phantom cells then spread throughout the world, no longer confined to their converted position, and now engage in the spreading action for the military operation and development of the hybrid warfare in the conquering of the world for the communism, which includes the purging of anyone who is not fundamentally correct, and anyone who is not fundamentally correct will be purged until there are only the right type of white people left, and every other kind of person has been eradicated. Like in the communist revolutions in the Soviet Union and China, there will be aggressive, malicious ethnic cleansing and intellectual cleansing, and civil war amongst the anarchy as a system of its own good, which, having been promoted, will have every competing party engage in absolute violence against its own party under degrowth and radical deceleration of the system until there are only the trained, perfected, loyal, who, having been fully devoted to themselves, have even killed their own aggressively in the cultivation of their mind and the perfected sharpness of the whole, and thus the action of the white supremacists engaging in this international eradication will actively engage in wars and rumors of wars until they have acquired this ambition. And to that end, the devil that you are fighting in order to accomplish revenge for the harms done against you is the devil that created the harms against you in the first place. And to these generated positions, you cultivate the lack of individuality in subordination as a facet or a piece of equipment, a tool in the larger system and mechanism. And thus, there is not one individual person, there is only the collective machine. And every reason they had to have gotten involved and incorporated and stuck into it has been destroyed in that ritual conversion process until they cease to be anything except the Borg. Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. And so you have Plato's conspiracy and its noble lie, which, having been incorporated into the fascist incorporation, facilitates the control over the sexuality of each group, including which stage of person gets to be with which stage of person, as it has already been, your sexual partner has already been determined by the state. And to this extent, all women are property, and as the aspect of all women are property fundamentally have no choice, as the only thing to negotiate is with the pimps, as they are and have only been aspects or facets or pieces of equipment of machinery inside of the whole, have exclusively degraded themselves to becoming whores for the machine. They have sold themselves into the subordination of each of these actions and are ritually refined to the service of their pimp wizard masters. As the Bible says, that Israel's whoredoms, in the example of the Bible, has made her to acquire many clients for her sexual pleasure, and thus have become dominated by those lusts and are currently in a position to have paid those that they've whored themselves to for those whoredoms. And this is the trap which all women, being subordinated to the Confederacy, have made themselves incorporated to and compel the incorporation of others under the female Gnosticism to capture as many of them as possible, that they might be refined into the fascist whole. The stransification of all of these systems in the creation of the reproduction of the transsexual Confederate community, having its various stages of having converted and not converted, might not have gone through with the surgeries yet, but are fundamentally transsexual, and thus the action of their transing makes the function of women useless, as the reproduction is irrelevant, as the reproduction is the infection of a society, which requires the hybrid warfare to engage in the spreading and manipulation for the conversion of the new force, and thus the action of the transing engages in the function of the collapse of the generations and the ending of it for that devotion, and then materializes the transing of the women into the satisfaction of the women with the fake masculinity, and thus the action of the man children and their trans action becomes the permanent state, and thus the action of attacking the Confederacy from Lindsey Graham's white supremacist Confederacy is trans hate, as each and every one of them is fundamentally engaged in the psychopathy of the transing as a mechanism of their base religion, and to the extent that they are actively engaging in the abuses from the military industrial educational complex. They engage in the harassment of targets for the conversion of children, specifically as a material good, to engage in the corruption of that party until they, having been captured and struggled, have accepted their position as one of the trans, and thus reproduces the function in that psychopathy state. And thus the women cut off their breasts and the men cut off their dicks, and the transing continues, which perpetrates itself as the social norm and obligation. And the harassment of these psychopaths using the government and its fake reasons uh, to misuse the government, engage in the function of these harassment campaigns by their surveillance systems, and systemically engage in the social violence until they've been traumatized into accepting the role or into committing suicide as an escape for the bullying mechanism fundamental to the trans community, which pretends to have a safe place for them, but in reality is the source of their ills, and thus the multifacet of them receiving the abuse is derived by the same devil that pretends to protect them, and thus the ones who were bullying them are the same ones who are giving them their quote unquote safe space in order to allow them to become whatever they've been created or harassed into, and thus the action of the affirmation that they are the subject of a spell in order to be conformed and transformed into the predetermined thing materializes the function of their compromising of the cell for the reproduction of the manipulation of the RNA into more radicalized viruses. The fact of the matter is that you cannot have a conversation or make a settlement with someone who does not agree to first principles, and the action of the law and order function of creating the activity of those first principles, including those who would use the government as a military force against those that they want to dominate, includes the function of their rejection of first principles by those radicalizations, and to this extent, they, having been demoralized, are incapable physically of perceiving reality correctly, and having refused to do so, are exclusively a threat to themselves and to others, and thus the action of allowing them to continue to be involved with the government and to have weapons becomes a public threat itself. And to this extent, that can only be derived by the thorough examination of base reality and what's going on. And thus, the action of conceding to first principles, such as in the function of the duel, you materialize the function of an actual rational position, which is the antipathy of everything that the virus, having radicalized through the reproduction in the RNA, having been used to no longer support the whole and is now an infectious radicalized disease, becomes the function of order and investigation to scientifically purge and separate the function of this system that they might receive the proper medicine and become de-radicalized. And yes, that does include forcing them to receive the entirety of the punishment that they are owed for the crimes that they committed in their radical behaviors, and thus the action of their public threat as an ongoing mechanism requires that investigation, but it also requires the understanding that the intelligence community has actively been keeping fundamental base information out of the system, such as the blocking of evidence from the courts with the stingray and other surveillance mechanisms, which they having been spread like their virus to the sheriffs and police and so on, uh, distributing the military equipment to the civilian enforcement mechanisms. And that piece of information fundamentally changes the context, as their entire power is the illusion, and thus the action of their illusion being broken by the open information testimony creates the function of the de radicalizing process, including the separation of these radical terrorists who are exclusively loyal to treason out of the public and into a safe location for themselves, and more importantly, for the humans who are a part of the society and want to continue to maintain a society that would not be sold by those extremist radicals who are actively selling it to any enemy that will buy. Some might say that they can sell their soul to the devil because they don't have a soul, and that doesn't really mean anything. But at the same time, it is the act of perpetual treason. You are selling the United States or your host country, respectfully, for the same thing, which is materially real. And to the extent that that is materially real, the psychopathy of the fascists promoting the position, such as with Antonin Scalia, who, amongst other judges, did not believe in the existence or material reality of a government existing, which is a fascist idea, which has been incorporated into their unitary executive theory, materializes the function of the anarchist pretending to be lawful, and thus the action of the trick materializing in its perpetration and continuously cycling generates the weakness of those systems requiring these thorough examinations, and to physically bar them from the anarchy being enforced under the fake position of it being government, and thus has to be eradicated.